record. Okay, well, hey everybody, my name is Joshua. Welcome, whether you're watching this on YouTube or through social media. Today we're going to be talking about a Christian's response to government. This has been a big topic over the last year, with some Christians saying we should respect the government, honor the government, comply with the government, particularly in regards to things like lockdowns and mandates connected to the coronavirus outbreak, but also with some beginning to speak about possible mandates and laws and rules and changes connected to climate change that we might see coming in the next few years. So I have shared different ideas online, and one person that has engaged both in agreement and in disagreement has been Luke. Now, Luke is someone I've never known well, but I have known both him and his wife while I was in Nottingham. Luke was involved in a church just down the road from us, and his wife, who wasn't his wife at the time, they weren't even dating at the time, was attending the church that my wife and I were a part of. So they're a good, godly couple. I would say this is, I before on other times on YouTube, I sometimes have maybe a progressive Christian on, or a more liberal Christian on, and there's more of a worldview clash. Luke and his wife are more what I might say my type of people. We run in very similar circles, theological circles. But I have noticed that in how we think of government and respond to government during these times, there's certainly been a different view when it comes to application of certain biblical principles. So I wanted Luke to come on to give him the chance to fully articulate himself, give him a chance to ask me questions, but also me to ask him questions back, just hopefully bring some clarity to these issues for everybody. So Luke, thank you very much for your willingness to come on, have this discussion with me. A lot of other people might be a bit intimidated, but you're a Londoner, right? This is nothing for you, right? Right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, like you say,
introduce yourself, and why don't you go ahead and share a little bit, maybe some of your thoughts and concerns, the way some evangelical Christians are responding to government mandates concerning coronavirus over the last year.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, Josh, I think these are the kind of things where I've noticed that Christians in, I think, like you say, similar theological circles might differ on, and I'm always really intrigued to find someone who sees things differently to me. And I think debate is really important, and having healthy discussion. And I think something that you and I would definitely agree on is that people can perhaps shut off or feel like attacked or intimidated by disagreement. I love it. I think I always learn from people when we thrash ideas around. So always up for that. I think the last the year and a half's been really crazy. I remember just 2 months before, or 6 weeks before COVID, being at a big church conference, leaders conference, and we were all worshiping Jesus side by side. We had some amazing teaching, and it was such a good time to spend with leaders from not just my own church but other churches around the country. And then suddenly all of that came to a halt in March. It was on my birthday. We'd said we'd go out for a family meal, and they said don't go out for a meal. And then a week later they put us all into lockdown, and church goes online, and we're away from each other for so long. And it was a really sad experience for a lot of us, and I don't think church is nearly the same as in person, same online as in person. I'm dubious that you can really do online communion. I just think there's something really physical about the bread and the wine that brings us together, and not being able to do that, not being able to worship shoulder to shoulder with people that I love and love Jesus with me, just wasn't the same. So yeah, lockdown sucked. I lost my cousin at the age of 29 to COVID, about a month into COVID, a month into the lockdown. Wasn't able to go to his funeral, which was really sad. And then even since then, going to see his family, like maybe a year later, it felt like there was a year of journeying there that I'd have liked to have been on with them, but wasn't able to. And I know that I'm not saying that to get your hopes out. I just know that there are a lot of people who've had similar experiences to that. And so yeah, lockdown sucked. And I think that would be something that you and I would be in agreement on. I think perhaps just from reading some of your posts, maybe where we would differ on would be that I think that government does have right to make decisions like putting us into a lockdown in some cases, and I think you would generally say no, a government shouldn't be doing that. That's an overstep of people's personal freedoms, and perhaps that would be where you and I differ, even though we both agree that lockdown sucks and that church just isn't the same without it. Would you say that's a fair summary of where we...
I think that's a good starting point.
Done?
That's a good starting point. Let's go from there.
Yeah.
Okay. So, you said, so the government has the right to put the population under lockdown in some circumstances. What sort of circumstances would those be?
I think a government's got to make a decision based on, has always got to make a decision based on what the situation, on the plausibility of a threat, and always to act in mind of the overall well-being of the people that it serves. So a government is there to serve the people rather than the other way around. I think that's a really important principle. And so whenever a government acts, it should do so with a view of protecting people as far as it can. And I guess in a case like COVID, the scientific information that we had at the time was potentially up to 500,000 deaths if this was left unchecked. And again, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not speaking as a scientist. I don't want anyone to put me as an expert, but let's assume that the scientists have done their homework and have then gone and independently advised the government and said, look, this is the situation that we're in. 500,000 people could die, and so drastic actions needed. So I think a government's response has always got to be proportionate to the situation that we're facing. I think, generally speaking, I want to see the government intervening as less as possible, because I think people can do a lot on their own initiative, can take their own risks with things. But then there are some situations, I guess, war, famine, drought, floods, natural disasters, a global pandemic, might be times where a government takes a stronger action. And I don't think I could give a definitive list of exactly where the line is. But generally speaking, I would say that if there's a plausible risk of hundreds of thousands of deaths, that would be where I'd want stronger action from the government. And if there isn't a risk of that, then I would err on saying people need to be making their own minds up, taking their own risks and accepting the consequences for that. Does that help? I feel like I've talked around about there, but there's a bit of nuance in it.
So a couple questions come to mind. So you did, just so curious, what subject did you take at university?
Philosophy and theology.
Yeah, I thought maybe you took theology. Okay, well, you were in the humanities department, and having gone through university, you're well aware of some of the more tyrannical governments of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Then so you're also aware that in most of these cases, whenever tyranny sort of came to power, individual rights got eased out, it was almost always associated with some need to act in an emergency for a greater good. There's a crisis, so we have to suspend freedom of the press in order to protect everybody.
Yeah.
Have to take away these rights because everyone's in danger, because the communists are coming, or the fascists are coming, or we're protecting you from this really bad thing. So just exchange your freedom for safety, and we'll keep
Yeah.
you safe.
Yeah.
So you understand
really
there's
I agree.
this,
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
looking back on history, whenever government says, hey, we're just going to take away some liberties, but don't worry, we'll keep you safe and we'll give them back as soon as the emergency is over. You understand why people maybe who read some books on history have a knee-jerk reaction. Like, I don't know if I trust you.
Yeah, I 100% accept that, Josh. I agree that there are lots of examples, and I think this is the thing. The phrase that I was trying not to use when I originally answered was the greater good, because I think the only reason, if I was a tyrant, the only way that I could try and convince you to give up your rights would be if I were to somehow say that it's for the greater good. If we were to think really cynically and say, okay, if you and I were to try and take over the world, how would we convince people to freely lay down their rights? And for me, the only way that I think we could possibly try that would be to somehow convince people that it's that there's some threat out there, and that we need, it's for the greater good. It's hard to see another way to do that. So yeah, I 100% understand the argument there. Okay,
good. So we're on the same page with that.
Yeah.
The difference may be does this current situation we're in risk beginning to step into that sort of direction? I would. There's some things with the way this is handled that makes me feel this sets a very bad precedent for the future, and that people of moral conviction on this, whether they're Christian or not, should be speaking out that against what I see as now other people might not see it as overreach, but what many do see as overreach. Another question I have for you then is, you said in cases of emergency, a civil government has the right to do that. How would you articulate to someone if someone said, what are, in a Christian worldview or a biblical worldview, however you want to say it, what is government created for? Kind of what is it supposed to do? And then what are the limits of that? What is it not supposed to do? Like, here is the circle. Here's what government can do. And then here are the lines government can't cross. Because to cross that, whatever the motive, whatever the circumstance, is now acting in a way that government was not created to do.
Yeah, that's a good question, Josh. And I think anyone who knows their Christian history, their theology, will know that Christianity arose in a circumstance where we almost didn't have the luxury of being able to ask that question and demand that from those who were in government over us. I think sometimes Christianity is being criticized or accused of having too much power and political power, and in some circumstances maybe there's a discussion to have there, but we forget that Christianity came from a position where it had no power whatsoever, no political power whatsoever, other than the gospel and a small group of growing people called the church. And you had a dynamic in the ancient Near East where the Romans were occupying the land, so the government were Roman, but a very significant Jewish population as well, where the local Jews disliked the fact that their land was occupied by the Romans, but the Romans, even though they were occupying it, had to find a way to make concessions to the Jewish population and work productively with them, and quite feared an uprising from the bottom up. But both sets of people, the religious authorities and the local people and the Roman Empire, in different ways saw Christianity as a threat, because it undermined their thinking, and yet Christianity still grew. So this is the case for 300 years, and then the Roman Empire took on Christianity into itself. That's why we have the Roman Catholic Church. But Christianity isn't set up to be a Christian state. Isn't like a theocracy, and I think we would agree on this. I think so. Where I wouldn't see a Christian state necessarily being one where everybody's a Christian or where Christianity is legally imposed. That's quite important, because the types of government that we invent, the modern way of seeing left and right politics, all of these things can come and go through the years, but God doesn't change, and his church isn't going anywhere. And so what limits would I want to see on a government, I think is a good question, but I don't think there's necessarily a biblical prescription of this is how government could be. I think we need to sift through a few principles. So the principles I would look at would be that every person is made in God's image. So that means that every person has something in them that reflects God. That goes regardless of their gender, their race, their background, their religion, any of that stuff. Every single person has something of the image of God in them, and that is a really important basis for human rights. And I think human rights of emerging countries which have been historically Christian, this is a really important principle, because you don't see this around the world. If we were living in India, where they believe in the caste system, it's much harder to convince somebody that someone who's poor has as much value as somebody who's much richer. Whereas we would say everybody, rich or poor, black or white, male or female, has something of the image of God in. But the second thing is to realize that everybody is fallen. And we get this from these principles from Genesis. So that means that every person has within them something that is sinful and has a tendency to go their own way rather than God's way. Sin being a short word with I in the middle of it. And sin is what happens when I put myself at the center of my life, and people sin in all sorts of ways. But a government needs to recognize this and have some checks and balances in place to ensure that justice is carried out, and be aware that people will commit crimes, will be selfish and be greedy. And whatever systems are in place, people will try and use those selfishly and will hurt other people. And so I would want to see a government that both respects human freedom and dignity, but also is able to put checks and balances in place to ensure that sin can't just have it can limit sin, even though a government will never save us. Having something that can limit things, and crime being an example of that. Is that helpful?
Yeah,
I feel like I'm giving a long-winded
I asked the
answer.
question too widely. I was trying to be.
Yeah.
I think my question is, what is a government supposed to do? So
Yeah.
if we, before we can point to the government and say you're not supposed to do that, we first have to know what the government is supposed to be doing.
So
before we can point at someone and say you're not supposed to be there, we first have to have an idea where they're supposed to be.
Would you, if I can ask a question back, would
sure,
you
feel free to ask questions.
I guess one question I'd be interested to know is, I said in my last answer that I don't think the Bible sets out clearly what a government should and shouldn't be doing. And I said this is something that you can sift through using principles from Scripture. And the two that I would look at would be the image of God and the fallenness of man. And the government needs to respect both of those things. There are more things as well. But would you see in Scripture a clearly defined here's what a civil government should and shouldn't do, or would you see this as being more here are some biblical principles, so here's how I think these would play out in this day and age? How would you see that question?
So I would see some more things in the New and the Old Testament, both where it's sort of prescriptive for what I'll use the big fancy word of civil magistrates. The kind of the classical Protestant term for it. The civil magistrates, they have a job. We see, of course, the way God sets up Israel, but we also see exhortations in the New Testament. I think maybe even one of your comments, you might have mentioned Romans 13, where it specifically says, and the government is God's servant to do certain things, to punish the evildoer, to protect what is good. So there are rulers and judges, and in the New Testament, we're called to recognize them for the job that God gives them, and to And of course, as you see, especially in the Old Testament, but I think a little bit in the New Testament, but to a lesser degree. But in the Old Testament with the prophets, rebuking the kings and, when they become tyrannical and begin to oppress the people instead of protecting them. So there are certainly broad biblical principles that the government should rule from. Things, as you mentioned, we're all made in the image of God, and therefore, one biblical principle is that you judge everyone fairly before the law. If someone is a thief, you don't judge them according to their class or give one a break because they're rich and powerful. Everyone's in the image of God, and therefore everyone's equally accountable to the law. So that's a principle. But I think there's also
which, by the way, is more unique in Christian societies, and I think that's something that's really important to. If I was talking to non-Christian friends and say, well, why is it that we? I know that's off the topic of this, but why is it that we treat people equally? And what basis do we have to believe in equality outside of Christianity? I think is an important question to raise.
So, for example, my view, and probably the view of many people who take my position, would believe that the government has a right to quarantine sick people. This is actually laid out in Scripture in the Pentateuch, that if someone is sick, if they're manifesting, specifically the plague of the day was leprosy, and that was given a clear thing to handle. That if someone is sick, they can be quarantined until they're better. And, they have to come before the priest, who sort of served like a doctor at the day. And he would check that, make sure it wasn't just a rash or eczema or something like this, but it was actual legitimate manifestations of the sort of quasi leprosy, skin disease that was infectious there in the ancient Mideast at the time. And if they were manifesting this sickness, then they could be quarantined until they were better. Then they could come out. And so on the basis of that, I would say that, yes, civil government can have the right to protect the public health from people who are clearly sick, in the same way that civil government has the right to protect someone who's clearly a criminal. But it needs to first be established that that person is a criminal. There is an innocent until proven guilty principle. And equally, there seems to be parallel with that in the Old Testament. There seems to be the healthy until proven sick principle. So I would say that the government does not have the right to quarantine an entire population for a year on the basis that, well, maybe they're sick. And the idea that we treat people, healthy people, as if they were sick, just in case, to be on the safe side. It's, if we were to switch categories and say, okay, we're not going to let any men work with children. You work with a charity. You work with a Christian charity. You work with young people. What if we said, well, most pedophiles are men. Therefore, we're going to pass a law saying no men can work with youth just because maybe they're a pedophile. And we're going to do that for the safety of the children. We would probably both agree that, you can't do that. You can't treat an innocent person as if they were guilty unless you prove they're guilty of doing that. I would say the Old Testament uses the same principle when it comes to things like quarantining and health outbreaks.
Okay, that's really interesting. I think that you've really laid out some good principles there. They are different situations, which you acknowledge, and so we've got to be careful not to use equivocation too much between situations. But you're right. It's that. So the outworking of that argument would be to say that a national lockdown would be like throwing everyone in prison until they can prove their innocence. And it's like, well, why are you doing that? Surely we should be doing things the other way around. I guess, like, perhaps a more general question I'd want to ask is, do you think that governments can ask people to limit and restrict their own principles if there is a genuine threat? So I'm not just saying, because a tyrant, would, like we said earlier, if there's an example I would give, might be with, today is the 11th of November, we're remembering people who gave their lives for our country here in Britain in the World Wars I and II, which I'm hugely thankful for. But it wasn't just people on the front line. Men and women and children had to make some big sacrifices to their personal freedom, and that might include choosing to have their lights out and not and making sure that they weren't. Now, I imagine we would agree on this, but someone with like a freedom is like, with the freedom as your highest goods lens on, could say, well, surely I can take my own risks. If I want to have lots of friends around for dinner and have my lights on while the blitz is happening, surely that's my own risk. And the counter argument to that would be, of course, say that if you have your lights on, you're giving away our position to the enemy. Even if your next door neighbor has their lights off, you then put them at risk as well. So I'd say these things aren't too clear cut, but I imagine you would say the government were right to say to everyone, turn your lights off, restrict your freedom, you have to ration your food. Horrible limits on freedom, which nobody wants and suck, but worth in that case for the greater good. Like, would you see it that way if we were to get in a time machine and go back to the 40s?
No, that's a good point. When a nation is under attack from the enemy, it's not just the army that has to be disciplined and respond. The whole nation has to respond. When bombs are falling from the sky. And there's biblical precedent from that for when Israel is invaded, and Saul and David had to raise an army real quick on the basis of their survival. So I think at war times, you can have that sort of precedent. It's interesting how you asked at the beginning, though. You said, can the government ask people to make sacrifices? And I think if the government had only asked people to make sacrifices, I don't think you would see the massive protests against this that you're seeing. If they said, here are some guidelines, when you're with elderly relatives, please keep this in mind. We would suggest you wear a mask, or we would suggest this and that. And here's some guidelines. Here's some things we ask of you. I think if that had happened, I think a large part of the percent of the population, if not the majority, would have taken many of those practical things and applied it to their situation. Why? Because they love their relatives. If they're going to see their mother or their uncle, their grandparents, they love them, but they need to weigh that. But the government wasn't asking them to do anything. They were telling them to do something on the risk of being fined, and it was that difference between asking and then the micromanaging of what traditionally has been seen as family affairs. If I want to see my mother who lives in a different house, that's and it's flu season, or there's some sickness going around, well, maybe I won't see my mother, maybe I'll just call her. But that's always been a decision to be made between me and my mother or my grandmother. And my grandmother died of COVID. You mentioned your cousin. My grandmother died of COVID as well in all this.
I'm sorry to hear that.
So, well, thank you. So these are, all issues that, I think a responsible government does give guidelines to people. But there is a line that government should not cross. So if you were to...
So for you, would that line be the difference between asking and telling, even in a national emergency?
It would depend on the nature of the emergency, but I would say yes. Unless it's... So, for example, if we're in... There is overlapping magisterium, because what we're talking about is the relationship between not just individuals and the state, but church and the state. So, and I'm trying to uphold that there's a line that government should not cross, and that belongs to the church. And particularly in lockdowns, it should have been individual congregations to decide what their protocols should be, not the government telling churches they can't meet for a year. Specifically, if many people, not everyone, but many people believe it's a New Testament command to meet physically. And so it should have been left up to the congregations. Now, I think what you're asking is, if we're holding a church service in the city and all of a sudden the fireman runs in all his fireman gear and says, the building next door is on fire. Everyone evacuate. We're not going to have an elders meeting where the elders sit around and discuss, should we evacuate the building or not? Because this is an overlapping issue, there's the, we as the elders are responsible for the worship of the church, but the firemen are responsible for keeping the fire from spreading and people from being harmed. And I think there's this area that falls in the middle of this overlap. But now let's say what happens, that they say, everyone out, there's a fire right next door and your church is about to be consumed by the flames. So we all go rushing out of the building. And then we kind of look around and we don't actually see a fire. And then someone points to it and they say, oh, 2 blocks down, Aunt Sally, she, her kitchen's on fire, but it's being put out. And we think, oh, okay, well, that seems like it was a little bit exaggerated and unnecessary. And so then the very next week, we're holding our church service. And again, the fireman kicks down the door and says, everyone out, the building next door is on fire. This time I might send out one of the elders just to check, but before I send out all the people to make sure we're really all about to die. And if the fireman keeps coming back week after week to say, everybody out, the building next door is on fire, when we suspect, though there could possibly be a fire in the neighborhood, he's greatly exaggerating the situation. At some point,
there's like the boy who cries wolf kind of thing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we'll probably stop listening to him and say, listen, you're in a church. We have responsibility to call the people of God together to worship. So though generally we recognize this is your area, through moral negligence and clear use of exaggeration, you've exaggerated the risks, and we're not going to, at some point we're going to stop participating with this.
I agree. I think that's a really, it's a helpful example of where you have two groups, two parts of society. You've got the church and state, and where where's the line. And sometimes the state, represented by the fire brigade in that anecdote, has a right to step in and try and protect, i.e. put a fire out. But if there's not an actual fire, and if they keep doing something which becomes a bit of a boy who cried wolf situation, that's going to eventually lead to a place where the church doesn't listen or doesn't want to listen. Potentially even ends up a more dangerous situation, because you want people to trust each other. And I think a functioning society is one where we feel like we can at least, even if I don't agree with everything the government say, I'd want to at least trust that they're trying to act in my best interest with the information that they have at the time. But if that trust breaks down, that then makes people feel very restless and worried about where they stand. We want to have people in leadership who are trustworthy. So I noticed at the start of that answer you said about how, and I think I would agree with you on this as well, is that whether a government is that generally we would want a government to be asking things of people. An example might be asking people to get a vaccine. I would be very uncomfortable if the government were trying to enforce that on people who didn't want a vaccine, even though I've been vaccinated myself. But I'm not going to, pick any arguments with someone who's, for their own reasons, chosen not to. But the government have approved their vaccine. They're encouraging people to take it. I would be against enforcing that on people, as an example. But are there any examples that you could think of where a government could just tell people, this is what you have to do and this is what the law is? So if we go back to the example of the Blitz, the government didn't just ask people to turn their lights off. They had police officers going around every night, knocking on doors, telling people to put their lights out. So I guess that's an extreme
because
example,
having your lights on was a treasonous act. You were, by turning on your lights, you were communicating with the enemy. They were German bombers in the sky, and by you turning your lights on, you're communicating with the enemy. Come and bomb us. Now, Romans 13 says God has given the civil governments the sword to wield. to protect the good and to, punish the evildoers. So in this case, as a military exercise, the government certainly does have a right to stop communications, from citizens or subjects of the country with the enemy. That is I would see military leadership being a government matter, both in the Old and the New Testament. The sword is given by God to national leaders to wield. So communications with the enemy, giving away strategic locations by having your lights on, that seems to go against the authority that God really did give to the government.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I guess the reason I highlight that is because it seems that you and I are in agreement that generally we want to make sure that government isn't being more authoritative than they need to, but we also are in agreement that there are some situations where a government can just be really authoritative and tell people, no, you can't have a tea party with your friends. You're turning your lights off because there are bombers in the sky. That's a very rare and thankfully a very rare example, and quite an extreme one, but a helpful one in that it just highlights perhaps that there is a line. The government isn't just always there to ask. It can tell us on some occasion if there is an actual threat. So I guess
right now in countries, in Canada, in Australia, actually in Denmark, believe it or not, this kind of surprised me. It's a brand new law this rolled into. If you want to go to church, you have to be vaccinated. You have to show a vaccine passport to get into church. Do churches have a moral obligation to obey the government and say, well, Romans 13, we got to do whatever the government tells us to do. So we got to put a guard out there in front of the church, make sure none of those unvaccinated people get in. This is a real thing in Canada. These are our allies. These are our countries. These are part of the Commonwealth. It's not too difficult to imagine that could happen in this country. I hope it doesn't. Probably won't, but we don't know. It's happening in other countries now. In that situation, do churches submit to the government, or do they say, as Christians, we can't comply with this?
Yeah, this is a good question, Josh. I think to give my if push comes to shove answer first, I would say no. I think I think our different types of authority have order, and that's given so that we can and that's helpful for us. So for me, in my life, the first authority is God's word. The church has a real high authority in my mind, and I give a lot of weight to what my church leaders say and think. However, if I think that a church leader is asking something that I don't see biblically, I'd want to have a conversation with them about that. But I would obey scripture over if those things were in tension. An example being from the church I grew up in was infant baptism. So I have a lot of respect and love from friends of mine who practice infant baptism. And I also respect that the church has almost always practiced infant baptism through its history. But personally, I don't see it in the Bible, and neither did my parents. And so because for them, it was like the church is teaching this, but we just think the Bible is teaching this, the believer's baptism, and we would respectfully go with what the Bible teaches. And in this example is where in your kind of pyramid of authority do we put government? And I would say I respect government. They have been given to rule over me, and I submit to them in the same way, and I would also submit to my church leaders. But being submissive to your government doesn't mean that in some cases you don't constructively disagree with them. I think what I would say pastorally to somebody is that maybe our first reaction, or my first reaction, would be to do everything I can to seek a constructive conversation with my government, so that to try not to get to a point where it has to be like a standoff. Like if needed, I would say no. I think the government's wrong on this, and this maybe is something for church eldership and trustees to think about. You know, how much trouble are you willing to get in as a charity, as a church, from your government to go along with this? And I'm quite grateful I'm not an elder or a trustee for that reason. So I feel like I'm speaking quite hypothetically here. But if we go on that principle that authority has order, and where do you put that? If government are asking me to go along with something that I'm just not seeing biblically, then I'd feel very uncomfortable doing that. But I would want to make some kind of representation to government, and I would be saying, look, are there other options available? For instance, could we say someone might have a reason for not wanting to get a vaccine, but could we not say that if they've had a negative test within 3 days before attending, that's an exception to the rule? Or just saying to people, don't attend church in person if you have COVID, or if you've tested positive, or if you have symptoms, might be a more sensible route to take. But yeah, I mean, how would you see that? Would you see that similarly? Do you think there's ever a precedent for a government to tell people, no, you can't come to church, or to close a church down?
Well, like I said, I think not only, for usually common sense dictates, if it's the winter and you wake up one Sunday morning and you're sneezing and coughing, maybe you go to the toilet and vomit, and you're aware, well, I have the flu. You're not going to go to church that day,
No.
and that's been true for years. You wake up, you're sick. You're like, man, I love my brothers and sisters in Christ. I'm not going to go. Hopefully we don't need a law, the government, to tell us not to do that. Why? Because we love the people we're going to meet at church. Yeah. So I would love to think that we don't need a law that says, if you have COVID, please don't go to church. Usually Christians are pretty good at that, just with the common cold, much less something like COVID. But yes, in theory, if the government, if you do have an infectious disease, I'm fine with the government saying you should stay at home, you shouldn't go to work, you shouldn't go to school, you shouldn't go to church. But let's just be clear, we're treating sick people as sick, not healthy people that maybe potentially could be sick.
Yeah.
My concern is that, I see Christians kind of using Romans 13 as we kind of need to do whatever the government says, unless it's really clearly, absolutely a sin, like go commit adultery or go worship idols. And I think if you take in the whole of what the Bible says, it's maybe a little more nuanced than that. I think we're both conservative evangelicals, so we would agree that with the Bible when it says, wives, submit to your husbands. Yeah. Okay. But we both know that can be abused. Yeah. If a wife comes in and talks to us and says, my husband always demands I dress this way, and he thinks I'm putting on weight, so he doesn't let me eat any meat, or he says I can't see my mother and my friends, and I'm never allowed to go out of the house. And she started listing all these things. You'd say, whoa. Husband, you've been given an authority and you're a leadership, but it's for something. It has parameters. You can't just come home and say, all right, wife, I want to sit back and watch you run up and down the stairs 25 times. And you have to do it because, it's not a sin. The Bible doesn't say anywhere that you can't run it up and down the stairs 25 times. You'd say, no, this is an abusive form of your authority. We would say that the same for elders. If a pastor or an elder was coming into your house, telling you what type of music you should listen to, telling you what sort of foods you can keep in your refrigerator, you'd say, all right, Luke, I don't want you to drink milk anymore. And you say, well, I'm not gonna listen to you, pastor. Well, why? Is it a sin? God didn't command you have to drink milk, or it's not an absolute sin to avoid drinking milk. Lots of people don't drink milk. You'd say, yeah, but you don't have that sort of authority. You were given to authority to do something, and you're now operating outside of those bases. And so we both agree on that. My concern is that then when we get to government, we sort of give government, well, the government can ask anything of us, as long as it's not really a clear black and white sin, like go commit adultery or worship idols. We almost, there's never a point where we say, whoa, government, you're operating outside your parameters.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that, and I guess part of the, I have to say, reading news from around the world just makes me so grateful to live in a time where we have a democracy, where we can, even if we don't like a government, 5 years later we get a chance, or 4 years if you live in America, a chance to vote them out if we think that they're abusing their power, and that does put a lot of onus on the government to win us over as the electorate, because if we do feel that they are being too overstepping things, then we have a way to get rid of them, which Paul didn't when he wrote Romans 13. I guess a question I've been curious to ask Josh is whether if we take two of the things that we've talked about, were the blitz, where we would say yes, that we can agree government can be really authoritative there and does have the power to stop people from turning their lights on or even eating certain foods. So the government were regulating and giving people food coupons. You couldn't buy food, you had to have coupons, because they're really strongly regulating that, and that there are reasons for that during the wartime, right? And I don't think we would say that the government overstepped the mark necessarily. They had the information that they work with the information they've got, the situation that they're in, which is that the Nazis had cut off food supplies, so we had limited food. They're trying to bomb us, so we had to turn lights off, and a horrible situation to live through. And very grateful that we did. But in that situation, they've been much stronger. And then the other one was around the firefighters saying, well, they've been trying to put out a fire that wasn't really going on, and was actually like Susan's fire down the road, and they're just trying to limit things. So I wonder if, like, do you think our disagreement on lockdowns, would you say the disagreement is about the role that government play, or would it be, do you think it's that you and I have a different view on the threat that COVID faces? Would you do you see what I mean? Like, is it that
I would say,
like, I don't think COVID's a big issue, so actually the government are overstepping it, or is it that you think that COVID is a big issue but the government don't have a role to do that anyway?
Yeah, I think we probably have both. I would say I do think I do have questions about to what degree lockdowns actually work in preventing COVID. I'm not fully convinced that they're as effective as sometimes they were claimed to be. So I'm not, that is true. I do question the efficacy of lockdowns. But does the government have the authority to tell Christians they can't meet together for worship for a year? Yeah, I don't. Even if it was as dangerous as some of them say, or some of them said, even if it was that dangerous, and even if lockdowns were as effective in stopping the spread, I believe the New Testament calls Christians to gather together for things like you said at the beginning, for communion, for baptism, and that it should be, if anything, the Christian leaders having a say so. It shouldn't be a full capitulation. Well, the government said it, so we're not going to meet. And we're just going to not meet until the government tells us it's okay again, because we're just going to submit to. Again, that's a different question than saying, should Christians take safety measures? If there's something that really is as dangerous as the Spanish flu going on out there, and if COVID were really as deadly as the Spanish flu, which, I don't think it is, but even if it were, in that case, you say, well, if the triune God of Christian scripture says that Christians should assemble to worship him corporately, then the leadership say, how can we do this? We love our people. We don't want them to die. And, you might have them meeting out on a field. You might have them 6 feet apart. You might have, certain things in place, but we still have a responsibility to gather and praise the name of the Lord on the Sabbath, and worship him. And so the government, just because the government says, well, as you joked earlier, for the greater good, slow the spread, flatten the curve, no church for a year.
Yeah.
that we just say, well, okay. No, I don't
Yeah.
think it should be that way. I think if anything, the government can ask churches to take safety measures,
Yeah.
in which case, fine, that's good. But no, they don't have the
Yeah.
authority to command Christians not to meet together for worship.
Okay, that's interesting. I think it was. I think I asked that because sometimes I've noticed, maybe like in the conversations we've had on Facebook, or perhaps with comments with other people, it's. I'm intrigued to know the basis for having that disagreement, because I think there are two reasons you could say I don't agree with the lockdown. You could say A, because you don't think government have the right to do it, or B, because you don't think that COVID is a thing, or that it's a conspiracy theory. I don't think you think it's a conspiracy theory, but an extreme example might be someone who thinks the whole thing is just a hoax, which I definitely think is a ridiculous idea. But it's I could see why, if you thought that COVID's not as, either the lockdown's not effective or that COVID isn't as dangerous as they say it is, then that then raises a question on, well, is all of this stuff necessary? So it might be that we've actually got the same view on what government can and can't do, but with a different view on how significant COVID is, might disagree on lockdowns, because one thinks that lockdowns are effective and that COVID is a real threat, and the other person doesn't see it that way. And that's the basis of their disagreement. But it sounds like for us, it's perhaps like a little bit of both. I think maybe I would see COVID as more of a threat than you would, and so be more willing to reluctantly accept a lockdown. And if you don't see lockdowns as particularly effective, and COVID as much of a threat perhaps as it was said at the start, then that might be some of where we see things differently.
Well, I mean, I accept COVID as a very real risk, particularly for older people or people who are obese in particular. Now, I know sometimes younger, healthier people die, but I also know there are definitely some categories that are much more at risk than others, and people who are in those categories should probably take certain precautions. So I don't mean to minimize COVID, although I think all of us realize it's not as deadly as we thought it was when we were seeing pictures from China where all these bodies were piled high in the streets. And, we now know that was a bit of Chinese state propaganda. But, we certainly, I mean, I willingly closed my church at first because I was told 5 to 10% of the population would be dead, and the people would be laying out in the streets, bodies in Fairfield. And so, I had this image.
I don't think they've been, I mean, I don't want to change, thing of the question, and neither of us are scientists, but I think, they had said a reasonable, in the UK, they had said a reasonable worst case was 500,000 people dead. Yesterday, as of yesterday, we've had 42,000 people dead. It depends on how you measure that. So the number of people who have died within 28 days of a positive test, but it's actually higher than that if you look at the number of mentions on a death certificate, which is 165,000 people who have died with COVID written on their death certificate. So I mean, very sad statistics. But I wonder if they're saying that a reasonable worst case is 500,000, and then a load of measures get put in place, and that comes down to 142,000. If maybe they did have a point at the start to say actually that could have been the worst case if we weren't, I guess, is how long that is over.
Yeah, so this is a deadly thing, particularly for certain categories of people. My question is just how efficacious the lockdowns really are. How many lives were spared because your church was, I mean, a given person's church was closed for a year and they didn't worship the Lord for 1 year. I'm more worried that lockdowns are more costly in terms of mental health, depression, loneliness, isolating people in an already fragmented society. I think for a lot of people, by giving a blanket lockdown for everybody, regardless of age or health, and a lot of young people, and you're in the charity business, you work with young people, how many mental health issues are out there. I oversee the youth work in our church, I see what this did in terms of depression, relationships, and it was just really not good. And I think the one size fits all lockdown for everybody, regardless of health issues or age, I think that was foolish. But again, that's not really the point of, I think, why we even wanted to have the conversation. Does the government have the authority to put these sorts of limits on the church whenever it deems it's for the greater good? And so my view was, no, listen, we've exceeded our timeline. I think we set out about half an hour, and we're getting close to an hour now. So Luke, I want to give you the last word. A lot of the people who would maybe watch this YouTube channel are maybe more sympathetic to my position generally. So please, you're the guest. So please go ahead and have the final word. Say whatever it is you would like to communicate to the audience.
Oh, thank you, Josh. It's been really nice to come and speak to you. I really appreciated it. And no, I think a very healthy conversation. I think perhaps something that we would have to agree on would be that that moving forwards, there does have to be a really strong element of doing things at your own risk. Now, people do have vaccines available. There's medication for COVID that's becoming available as well. We can't keep everything in a stalemate, and for people's discipleship in a church context, it's so important that people are turning up in person and for work, for the economy as well. So we do need to transition to a place where people are able to just take their own risks, and but also have the right things in place, like the availability of vaccines and medication if anybody does get sick. But I do think this is an issue that Christians are able to agree to disagree on here, and I think it's been really interesting to talk to you, Josh. I genuinely do feel like I learn a lot from people who see things differently to me, and this isn't just saying that, I really do. And I think what I've begun to recognize is that it's very easy as Christians for us to accept a worldview that's just around us, or we see on social media, or we pick up from our own cultures. And so having conversations like this really helps us to think critically about that and think, do I believe this because it's what my culture says, or because that's the message that's been put out by the media or government or the friends that I have, or is this because I'm really actively allowing my worldview to be shaped by Jesus and his words? So I think these conversations are really helpful for drawing us back to those things.
Okay. Thank you, Luke, very much. Thank you for your time, and thank those of you who took the time to watch the whole thing. Thank you, everybody, and please feel free to leave comments either on YouTube or Facebook or wherever it is you're watching this. Luke, all the best to you, and please say hello to your wife, Claire, for me. God bless.
Also will. Thanks, Josh.